Following message come from QuickBooks. When you work for yourself, every mile you drive for business is worth money back at tax time. Never miss a mile with QuickBooks Automatic Mileage Tracking. Smarter business tools for the world's hardest workers. QuickBooks, backing you.
This is the TED Radio Hour. Each week, groundbreaking TED Talks.
TED Talks.
TED.
Technology.
Entertainment. Design.
Is that really what it stands for? I've never known that.
Delivered at TED conferences around the world.
The gift of the human imagination.
We've had to believe in impossible things.
The true nature of reality beckons from just beyond.
Those talks, those ideas, adapted for radio. From NPR. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, Confronting Stigma. Ideas about why we judge certain behaviors and conditions, and how those judgments can make it all the more difficult to honestly talk about them, or even deal with them in a constructive way, like how we deal with drug addiction.
You know, one of the most shocking things I learned in my research was that I had completely misunderstood what I thought I'd seen right in front of me. So I'd been watching people I love with addiction problems since I was a child, and I thought I understood why it had happened.
This is journalist Johann Hari. A few years ago, he wrote a book about drug addiction and the war on drugs called Chasing the Scream.
So if you'd said to me, you know, when I started doing the research, what causes, let's say, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. I would have said, well, obviously, Guy, heroin causes heroin addiction. The clue is in the name, right?
Yeah.
We think if we seized 20 people off the street and like a villain in a Saw movie, we forcibly injected them all with heroin every day for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all have an addiction problem for the obvious reason that there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to kind of desperately physically need. And that's what addiction is, right?
That's what we all assume, right? You take heroin for 20 days, you're probably going to be addicted.
Exactly. And I only began to understand what's really going on, and in fact what had gone on in my own family, when I went and met an incredible professor called Bruce Alexander in Vancouver. And Professor Alexander explained to me, this theory of addiction that I had in my head, that it's caused by the chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. You take a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. But Professor Alexander was looking at these experiments in the 70s, and he had this kind of realization. Wait a minute, we put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except take these drugs.
Yeah.
What would happen, he thought, if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, and it's basically heaven for rats, right? They got loads of friends, they got loads of grain, they got loads of tunnels to scamper around, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. None of them ever used it compulsively. None of them ever overdosed. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when their lives are bad to none when their lives are good and they have the things that make life meaningful for rats.
Now, even though this study in the 1970s was just for rats, it turns out there was a similar scenario playing out for humans at the exact same time. Johann Hari picks up that story from the TED stage.
It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings.
But I mean, here's the thing, Johan. I mean, there are people who come from stable backgrounds, who don't have difficult external conditions in their lives, and who don't have that single rat in a cage situation, and they still become addicts. I mean, that happens. It's not totally uncommon.
So I discussed this with lots of the experts and scientists I spoke to, and as I spoke to them and assimilated what they found in their research, I began to think of this analogy. So if you read kind of early feminist texts from the 60s, like Betty Friedan, there's a recurring thing that happens. Recurring scene where a housewife in the 1950s will go to her doctor and she'll say something like, "Doctor, there's something terribly wrong with me because I've got everything a woman could possibly want. I've got a husband who doesn't beat me, I've got a washing machine, I've got 2 kids and I've got a car, but I still feel terrible." Now, if we could go back in time and speak to those women, what we would say is, wait, you've got everything you could possibly want by the standards of the culture, but the standards of the culture are just wrong. You need much more than this. And I think in the same way, when I speak to people who say, what you're saying can't be right because I had everything I could want, and yet I still felt profoundly terrible and became addicted, are their psychological needs actually being met? Do they feel that their life is meaningful, that they are connected to deep meaning? Do they feel they belong? If you actually talk about those questions, which are much more important than whether you've got money, actually I think it demonstrates that their values, that they didn't have the things people want. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Now, to be clear, Johan isn't saying there's absolutely no biological basis for addiction. But what he is saying is that an environment steeped in shame and stigma can make it so much easier for people to turn to drugs.
In the run-up to the 2016 election, I was writing about some people who were doing a Get Out the Vote work, and we were on this long street in a place called Slavic City in Cleveland, and it was one of those streets where a third of the houses had been demolished, a third had been abandoned, and a third still had people living in them. Huge addiction problems, as you could just see walking around. And we knocked on one door, and there was a woman, I don't know if she had an addiction problem, but I strongly suspect she did. And we were talking, and she was actually very articulate, she was very angry, and she said something that has absolutely haunted me. She was talking about what the area used to be like, how everything that made the area make sense, the work, the sense of regularity, the sense of the future was all gone. And she was trying to describe what the area used to be like. And she meant to say when I was young. What she actually said is when I was alive. And I really reeled back. And I understood why this woman was so angry, and I understand why people who feel like that, when I was alive, right? When the things that made sense, when there was a community, when there was a sense of the future, if you take those things away from people, they will be in terrible despair.
In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. And they set a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, but take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it was fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back. to the old system.
It's amazing to me, like, that so at a certain point, Portugal was looking at their problem and they said, stigmatizing this is not working. All of the evidence has shown that that does not work. But if everybody knows this, I mean, that evidence is available to you and me, to our political leaders. It's available to societies all around the world. So what's the problem? I mean, why do most of us continue to treat addiction in the way we do?
I think it's a few things. One is people like me haven't done a good enough job of explaining what the alternatives mean. So when you talk about decriminalization or legalization, which happened in Switzerland, of heroin with incredible results I can tell you about, what people think we're saying is there should be, a heroin aisle in your local CVS, and, we want kids to use heroin, and, which of course literally nobody wants.
Right.
So we need to do a much better job of communicating what we're actually in favour of. And, Switzerland is a great example. Switzerland, at the same time as Portugal, had this huge heroin problem. They tried a slightly different approach. They got an incredible female president called Ruth Dreyfus, and Ruth explained to Swiss people, when you hear the idea of legalizing heroin, what you picture is anarchy and chaos. What we have now is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence and disease. Legalization is the way we restore order to this chaos. So what they did is if you had a heroin problem, you're assigned to a heroin clinic. I spent a load of time in the one in Geneva, which, by the way, Ruth Dreyfus lives opposite, which I think tells you something. And you're assigned to this clinic. You go in, you're given your heroin there, you can't take it out with you, you're watched by a nurse as you use it, and then you leave to go to your job because you're given loads of support to turn your life around. The results in Switzerland have been extraordinary. There have been 0 deaths on overdose on the legal heroin program since it began more than 15 years ago. I just want to repeat that. Literally nobody has died on the legal heroin program. The United States, your listeners don't need me to tell you, has had somewhat different outcomes. More people have died of heroin overdoses and opioid overdoses since you and I started talking in this conversation, Guy, than have died in the last 15 years in Switzerland. So at some point we have to look at, we all have anger about addiction and depression. At some point we have to look at the results. Policies based on stigma and shame kill people. They are deadly. And policies based on love and compassion work much more effectively. There's no silver bullet. There are still problems in Portugal and Switzerland, but their lives get better. For 100 years now, we have been singing war songs about people with addiction problems. We should have been singing love songs to them all along.
Journalist Johan Hari. His most recent book is called Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. You can see his full talk at TED.com. On the show today, ideas about stigma. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to the TED Radio Hour from NPR. Hey everyone, just a quick thanks to 2 of our sponsors who help make this podcast possible. First, to Subaru, whose love promise is a dedication to supporting communities. For Tucson retailer Rocky DiCristofano, that just makes sense.
It's simple in concept that we're trying to be involved and make the place we live a better place. And everybody goes to work knowing that this is a part of what we do at Tucson Subaru.
To learn more about the Subaru commitment to its customers and communities, visit Subaru.com/love-promise. Thanks also to Starbucks. For the past 43 years, Starbucks has served their bold signature espresso. But for the first time ever, they're introducing a second espresso, Starbucks Blonde Espresso. It's smooth and subtly sweet. So whatever your drink is, from a flat white to an iced Americano, try it with Starbucks Blonde Espresso. And as always, you can order ahead on your Starbucks app. And one more quick thing before we get back to the show. I want to let you know that Invisibilia, NPR's show about the invisible forces shaping our behavior, is back on March 9th with a new season. They're taking on Russian hacking, reality TV, the Me Too movement, and much more. You can listen and subscribe to Invisibilia on the NPR One app or wherever you get your podcasts. It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz. And on the show today, Confronting Stigma. Ideas about why we judge or cast aside certain behaviors or choices or even conditions, like depression.
Depression, anxiety, mental illness, none of that was talked about in my house.
This is Nikki Weber-Allen. She's a filmmaker who also runs a nonprofit that works to end the stigma around mental health, particularly among people of color.
And I think that is why I was under the impression when I first was diagnosed with it, that, this was just something that was unique to me and that this was just my own weakness. Most people in the Black community believe that that's what it is. So much of it is, particularly if you're from more of a disadvantaged background, where you're trying to figure out how to pay the bills, how are you going to put food on the table. The last thing you have time for in your mind is self-care. It's absolutely seen as a luxury. I think another part of it, though, is our complex history in this country, coming from slavery and Jim Crow and, institutionalized racism. We pride ourselves on our strength and our mental toughness and our resilience. That's what's gotten us through and what's helped us to achieve, so many things that we've accomplished over the last 200 years. So for us to not have that, we can't not have that. You know what I mean? So it was really distressing for me when I first found out, and I felt really alone, like I had let the family down. And that I needed to just kind of get over this and tough it out on my own. But it wasn't getting better on my own.
At the time, Nikki was a successful TV producer. She'd even won 2 Emmys for her work. So on the outside, it seemed like everything was fine. But on the inside, it felt like anything but.
It was like, I remember what it was like to be happy when I was younger. And I'd gotten to the point, I think, by 30, I was to the point where I was like, well, I guess that's just something that, kids are happy. But once you get older and you get a job, you're just never going to be as happy again as you were when you were young. And I still didn't realize that was the depression talking, So it wasn't until I went to the doctor, and the doctor suggested to me, you know what, a lot of your symptoms sound like they're related to anxiety and perhaps depression. I totally pushed back on him because that's not something that happens to me. That happens to other people. And I had in my head, that narrative that people with mental illness, those are the people you see standing on the corner and talking to themselves. That's not me holding down a job and a good job. And it just didn't jive with what I knew mental illness to look like. But still, at least I did go to the therapist. But because of the stigma, I didn't talk about it. I just went to therapy on my own and didn't share it with anyone, not even anyone in the family.
But that all changed one day when Nikki learned that someone else in her family had silently been suffering from depression. Nikki Weber-Allen picks up the story from the TED stage.
On July 4th, 2013, my world came crashing in on me. That was the day I got a phone call from my mom telling me that my 22-year-old nephew, Paul, had ended his life after years of battling depression and anxiety. There are no words that can describe the devastation I felt. Paul and I were very close, but I had no idea he was in so much pain. Neither one of us had ever talked to the other about our struggles. The shame and stigma kept us both silent. He had been struggling with depression and anxiety for a few years. I don't know exactly how long because we never actually talked about it. So, in the same family, we were very close, but because of the shame and stigma, I was afraid to talk to him. I wanted to be the cool aunt, Mm-hmm. So I didn't want him to think that something was wrong with me. So I was never open with him about it.
About your own depression?
About my own depression. And then it wasn't until after he died from suicide that I learned about his depression. Now, he had told his parents, but he had asked his parents to keep it quiet and not share it with the rest of the family because he didn't want people to think that he was weak.
He was ashamed.
He was ashamed. And so that just broke my heart. After that happened, I just thought, you know what? This is something that I have to change. I have to figure out a way to change this to open up these conversations about it. For Black Americans, stressors like racism and socioeconomic disparities put them at a 20% greater risk of developing a mental disorder, yet they seek mental health services at about half the rate of white Americans. One reason is the stigma, with 63% of Black Americans mistaking depression for a weakness. Sadly, the suicide rate among Black children has doubled in the past 20 years. Armed with this information, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be silent anymore. With my family's blessing, I would share our story in hopes of sparking a national conversation. A friend, Kelly Pierre-Lewis, said, "Being strong is killing us." She's right. We have got to retire those tired old narratives of the strong Black woman and the super masculine Black man who, no matter how many times they get knocked down, just shake it off and soldier on. Having feelings isn't a sign of weakness. Feelings mean we're human. And when we deny our humanity, it leaves us feeling empty inside, searching for ways to self-medicate in order to fill the void. These days, I share my story openly, and I ask others to share theirs too. I believe that's what it takes to help people who may be suffering in silence to know that they are not alone.
It's a little bit like one of the sort of tenets of treating fear is exposure, right? Like cognitive behavioral therapy, they talk about exposure. So people who have anxiety, they'll just force themselves to stand up in front of audiences and speak and
do
speak
a TED
and
Talk.
do a TED Talk, right? And I mean, it's the idea that if you are depressed and if you keep it hidden and closed, it makes total sense that it would get worse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But if you talk about it, which is like this huge obstacle for so many of us, it actually is the pathway to
Absolutely.
to healing, right?
Yeah, shine a light on it and own it, because you find that you're not alone. Since I've been really open, I can't tell you how many friends have reached out to me, family friends have reached out and said, "I've always struggled. I've been struggling for 20 years. I just never talked about it." Or, "Remember how we said Uncle Butchie died from cancer? Well, actually, it was suicide. We just didn't want to talk about it." Like,
wow.
This time and time again, I can honestly say there's not a week that goes by that I don't hear from someone I know personally or someone who reaches out to me because they saw the TED Talk to tell me about their own experience. I will always regret that I couldn't be there for my nephew. But my sincerest hope is that I can inspire others with the lesson that I've learned. Life is beautiful. Sometimes it's messy and it's always unpredictable. But it will all be okay when you have your support system to help you through it. I hope that if your burden gets too heavy, you'll ask for a hand too. Thank you.
Nikki Weber Allen. She's a TV and film producer, and she also runs the I Live For Foundation, which works to end the stigma around mental health. You can see her full talk at TED.com. When you were in high school, were you out and open?
We were raised Pentecostal, so it was a little difficult to be out because, every Sunday it's fire and brimstone.
This is Arik Hartman. He grew up in rural Arizona, going to church every Sunday with his family.
Sunday, Wednesday, Thursday. The longest time I thought I would just burn in hell forever had I come out, or my dad would kill me. But I decided to come out when I was 16.
And when Arik told his parents he was gay, it didn't go over too well.
It could have gone worse. But a little fun fact, when I did come out, my dad tried to demonically exorcise me.
Wow.
He invited the pastor and some friends over to kind of ambush me after school, and that was...
What happened? What did he do?
Well, luckily, my mom had come home early from work, and as I'm watching, they're kind of rushing out of the house with my mom screaming and threatening to shoot them, brandishing a gun. That was exciting.
After that, Arik focused on getting away from home. So in 2012, he enrolled in college at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette.
My friend group in college was just, a mix of straight people, gay people, everyone on the spectrum, and a lot of people who had backgrounds that were reflective of mine, growing up in a religious household, which is common in the South, growing up with parents who might not accept you, with families that might not accept you. So I was able to, I felt like I had made the right choice after talking to other people with similar backgrounds.
So Arik had escaped the stigma of being gay in a small religious community. But then something happened, and Arik had to confront a new stigma. And this one was much more difficult to escape. Arik told the story from the TED stage.
In the fall of 2014, I was a sophomore in college, and like most college students, I was sexually active. And I generally took precautions to minimize the risk that sex carries. Now, I say generally because I wasn't always safe. It only takes a single misstep before we're flat on the ground, and my misstep is pretty obvious. I had unprotected sex, and I didn't think much of it. Fast forward about 3 weeks, and it felt like I'd been trampled by a herd of wildebeest. The aches in my body were like nothing I have felt before or since. I would get these bouts of fever and chill. I would reel with nausea, and it was difficult to walk. Being a biology student, I had some prior exposure to disease, and being a fairly informed gay man, I had read a bit on HIV. So to me, it clicked that this was seroconversion, or as it's sometimes called, acute HIV infection. And this is the body's reaction in producing antibodies to the HIV antigen. It's important to note that not everybody goes through this phase of sickness, but I was one of the lucky ones who did. And I was lucky as in there were these physical symptoms that let me detect the virus pretty early. And I want a show of hands for these next few questions. How many of you in here were aware that with treatment, those with HIV not only fend off AIDS completely, but they live full and normal lives? Y'all are educated. How many of you were aware that with treatment, those with HIV can reach an undetectable status, and that makes them virtually uninfectious? Much less. How many of you were aware of the pre- and post-exposure treatments that are available that reduce the risk of transmission by over 90%? So, what I want to ask next is this. If we have made such exponential progress in combating HIV, why haven't our perceptions of those with the virus evolved alongside?
When you were diagnosed with HIV, who did you tell?
I told my best friends who were very supportive, and they were great about it. We kind of had this nice exchange, this dialogue, and that was very affirming. And then I told my roommates, who were also very good friends of mine, and they had a very interesting reaction. They broke down, they started crying, they were hugging each other. They thought I was going to die in front of them. And at this point, it's been like 4 or 5 weeks since infection. All my immediate symptoms were gone. So I'm feeling okay, but things started to change with that group of friends.
What happened?
I would just notice little initially, it was little things. One of my roommates, he would kind of sidestep around me when I was walking around. He was very peculiar about things that we had in common that we might touch, like a chair or silverware.
Wow.
I would cook large meals for groups of people, and I noticed that my roommates weren't eating anything I'd cooked, and that was kind of the seal on it. I knew something had changed, in our friendship.
Did you ever ask them why? Did you ever talk to them about it?
Yeah, I had sat them down multiple times, and I even went as far as to get this pamphlet on HIV from one of the local clinics and, explain to them, I'm not a danger to you. You are not at risk from infection. I let them know what the transmissible fluids were, rates of infection, what they could expect, and still it just persisted. It didn't matter how much I tried to sit them down and educate them. There was still this wall that I couldn't breach with them.
You know, Ark, one of the realities is that a lot of people, not just in Louisiana, but all over the U.S., all over the world, might be afraid, right? Like your roommates, they might stigmatize it.
I